Welcome everyone to my presentation on Hekate and the Restless Dead, which is sort of my educational event for Halloween. And as I mentioned previously, thank you to Sandra, who is listening at the moment as well, the server owner of the Divine Cove, for pitching this idea and hosting the crossover between the Divine Cove and the Sanctuary. My name is Quinton. For those who don't know me, my pronouns are they, them, and he, him. I am a Hellenic Polytheist, a Chimeticist, a witch, and an angel worker. I am a devotee of Hekate, Hermes, and Bast. And yeah, I'm very excited to be speaking about Hekate today, as I always am. This server is all about Hekate, if you hadn't noticed. So we'll get right into it. Here's the table of contents. We're going to be speaking about what and who the Restless Dead are, how the ancient Athenians interacted with them, how Hekate came to be known as the leader of the Restless Dead, and a couple misconceptions about the Restless Dead in modern practice. If you do have any questions or comments, feel free to pop them in the chat. They're not interruptions or anything, so don't be afraid to pop anything in there. And I can also take questions at the end if you have any. So here on this slide, I have a segment, the beginning of the Orphikim to Hekate, the Thomas Taylor translation. And it's it's my favorite Orphikim translation as well. I call Inaudian Hekate, lovely dame of earthly, watery, and celestial frame. Sepulchral, in a saffron veil arrayed, leased with dark ghosts that wander through the shade. And I decided to put this little segment here, the snippet here, because of the second last line we have there, leased with dark ghosts. And this is a reference to her domain over the Restless Dead and how she leads, as we see here, dark ghosts in reference to that. So the Restless Dead are spirits of the deceased who weren't able to move onto the underworld or through the underworld, for example, past the river Styx. And I think one of the interesting things about how that hymn and many translations of the hymn is that it uses the words dark ghosts rather than restless dead. And it's because there is no exact term for restless dead in ancient Greece. So back then they didn't say like restless dead as a term like we do these days. They had other terms for it. And we have three of the main ones here, three categorizations of the restless dead, among other terms that are used for ghosts or similar spirits. So the ataphoi, who lacked proper burial rites, the aioroi, who died prematurely, and the bia io thanatoi, who died by violence, such as by war. And they're not just ghosts, so there are different types of spirits. The Restless Dead isn't all-encompassing, but there are a particular kind, with spirits of the deceased being very much the signifier there. And they were said to be commanded by Hekate, and some say particularly that they are active on Hekate's Elpenor. So you may hear sometimes people doing offerings not only to Hekate, but to the Restless Dead to appease them. Seraphine asks, are these the only spirits of the dead led by Hekate? I'm trying to think if that's the case. It's her most notable, sort of entourage, you could say. I'm unsure if there's like a specific one that's noted, like other bands of spirits of the dead. Though, I suppose, as we'll touch on in a bit, cursed tablets were an interesting bit of sorcery that they did in ancient times, and it was believed that Hekate was a goddess who could be an intermediary between the underworld and mortals and sort of have spirits of the dead do something as commanded. And so I would say it might not necessarily be only I guess limited to the Restless Dead, And she is, of course, associated with necromancy in general, which necromancy doesn't necessarily need to be done with the restless dead. It can be done with other spirits of the dead and deceased. So I have a story here, the story of Elpenor. And this is a story of an Antithoi, a restless dead spirit who lacked proper burial rites. Elpenor is from the Odyssey. Homer's Odyssey, and one of Odysseus's crew members. So a bit of a summary of the story before I actually read a bit from the Odyssey is that when everyone else was sailing off after visiting Circe's island, he had rushed to join them but fell off the roof that he was drinking on the night before and broke his neck. So then... Did someone just soundboard? That scared me. When Odysseus arrived in the underworld later on, he was met by Elpenor first as a shade, who demanded to be buried properly, or else he would send the wrath of the gods. So here's our snippet from the Odyssey, translation by A.T. Murray, PhD. There then, O Prince, I bid thee remember me. Leave me not behind thee unwept and unburied as thou goest thence. I'm just going to quickly check Discord. Okay, all good still. And turn not away from me, lest haply I bring the wrath of the gods upon thee. Nay, burn me with my armour, all that is mine, and heap up a mound for me on the shore of the grey sea. In memory of an unhappy man, that men yet to be may learn of me. Fulfill this my prayer, and fix upon the mound my oar, wherewith I rode in life when I was among my comrades. So here we have an example in mythology where someone had passed away but had not been buried because Odysseus and his crew just sailed off on their quest. And so they after this, Odysseus had returned to the island to ensure that Elpenor had proper burial rites, and we see here that Elpenor threatens them with the wrath of the gods if he is not buried properly. So that's one example in mythology as well. So here's the question, what can the restless dead do? Most of what we know about the restless dead is from mythology and curse tablets, aka we don't actually know what their nature is for sure. And this is the case for a lot of what we, I suppose, read in Hellenic polytheism or when we study ancient Greek religion, is that a lot of our sources are based on stories and archaeological finds and things like that. But it also means that we don't know for sure what certain spirits or deities or the nature of certain things may be, because it could be through a certain lens, it could be missing some information and things like that. But at least from what they can tell us, they can, for example, demand funeral rites, just like we had seen, and also gifts for the afterlife, like clothing. So I don't remember the exact names of the characters, but there was a story as well where a husband was trying to search for something and the wife refused to tell him who was deceased because when she had been burnt clothing for her funeral rites, the clothing didn't burn properly, and so she was cold in the afterlife. And so it was only after he had all the women in that area sacrifice all of their clothing for her did she help out. It's also said that the restless dead can bring illness and nightmares to enemies. And one of the points I put here is make a single person's issue a civic issue instead, which I actually have a story about that coming up. But this means that one person who may have wronged a restless spirit, or I suppose wronged a deceased person who is then a restless spirit, that problem can become a problem for the whole city. So that restless dead can do something that makes everyone's issue. Such as how we actually heard that story just now about the gifts from of the clothing. It made it pretty much everyone else's issue as well to sacrifice the clothing, as commanded by the protagonist. They can also cooperate with the living if they are appeased. They can reveal hidden information, and they can drive people to madness and even death. So here we have some information about ancient Athens and some other places in ancient Attica as well, in regards to what they did or how they may have interacted with the restless dead in ancient Greece. The first, of course, being the funerary rites, which is a rite of passage. So in ancient Greece, they had particular rites for burying bodies, certain processions and activities done on specific days, and certain feasts that were done in order to properly bury the deceased. There have also been noted to be offerings and rituals, both for the affection and appeasement of the restless dead or the deceased. So, for example, affection, you may give offerings and do rituals for ancestors and those who are important to your family. And appeasement being to basically ensure that the wrath of the restless dead wouldn't come to your doorstep, such as how some people may offer to the restless dead during Deipnon. They had a couple of festivals that had mentions or involvement with the dead in terms of appeasing them as well, or doing offerings or honoring them. So in the Attic Genesia or the Anthesteria had days specifically about the dead. We also see very similarly with appeasements that they did protection workings against the restless dead, also known as apotropaic, right? So apotropaic means basically to avert evil, so rites that would avert evil or averts, in this case, the restless dead were considered spirits they didn't want to run into. As mentioned, there was sorcery done by some magicians, ancient magicians who would have used curse tablets, for example. Curse tablets were sort of their way of petitioning on sheets of metal the help of the restless dead or the dead in general, and they would place these cursed tablets inside or close to the graves of the deceased to possibly command illness or nightmares towards their enemies. And that's something you wouldn't do so easily. Don't go around cursing people and putting things into people's graves. That's not very respectful. Was there any specific sort of metal used for the tablets, Nim asks. There was. I don't quite remember. Maybe if someone else has, tin and lead. There were like very thin sheets of metal that you could like engrave. But there were specific ones, I believe, noted. And I also put here a point that not everything was necessarily labeled. So meaning they didn't have like a neat way, I suppose, of categorizing what different activities were with the restless dead. Like they didn't have, or as far as we know, they didn't have labels like we do with certain witchcraft or like magic or sorcery. And we don't like label all the, like they possibly didn't label all of the activities they did. So there may be ways they have interacted with the restless dead or the deceased that we don't know about. I also wrote here that some may not touch anything related to the restless dead with a 10-foot pole, unless there happened to be a situation where they might even consult an oracle about it. And that's related to the story that I have next. Styx's question, is the restless dead a category of spirit inside a bigger category of wandering dead, or are all wandering dead restless? I suppose that depends on the context and culture you're looking at. In this case, if there are deceased spirits walking the earth, like deceased spirits of like people walking the earth, it's related to the restless dead because it means they hadn't been able to pass on to the afterlife. Whereas in ancient Greek thoughts, I don't believe it was very desirable to stay on earth as a spirit that wasn't able to move on to the afterlife. So here's how we connect up Hekate. How did Hekate become their leader? And this information is based on one of Sarah Iles Johnston's chapters within her book, The Restless Dead. It was, interactions between the living and the dead in ancient Greece. Something along those lines for the title, but The Restless Dead book by Sarah Iles Johnston, particularly the chapter called Hekate and the Dying Maiden, which is essentially Sarah's or Johnston's way of concluding how Hekate became associated as the mistress of the dead. Some context as well for Hekate and her history. So it is said that within around the 5th century is when she began to gain these associations with the afterlife, with dark, quote-unquote, aspects, scary aspects. This was around where she was seen, more in that scary aspect. Because prior to the 5th century, we have evidence of worship and cult and practice that was not related to these more chthonic aspects of her. She was actually more of a benign, benevolent goddess prior to that, as we see in her shrine placements around Attica, also her cult of Legina, and in literature such as her earliest appearance in the Theogony, Hesiod's Theogony. And so it is said that she was established enough in this archetype by the 5th century because tragedies were able to refer to this role of Hekate without context. So some quotes here. Do you fear that you will see a phantom in your sleep? Do you expect to be attacked by attacked by the band of chthonic Hekate? Euripides' Helen states that Hekate is said to have the ability to send phantoms against the living even when they are awake. Yeah, and around this period she became known as a goddess of witches, sorcerers, magicians. Also, yes, a goddess of necromancy, as Leon noted, but this wasn't always the case. And I do have a separate presentation that I did, a separate lecture I did previously, called A Portrait of Non-Chthonic Hekate, which I do have a recording of as well in the server, so let me know if you'd like a link to that. And that gives more context to Hekate before the 5th century, but in this case, we're talking 5th century onwards. So here are some important facts as well about her and how this plays into her role as mistress of the restless dead. So from early literature, Hekate has been referred to as Korotrophos, which is can be translated to child nurse. And Hekate, like Artemis, was a goddess of women's transitions. So she was considered and is considered a midwife of birth and death. And some say that with her commitment to Persephone as her handmaiden and companion, she can be seen as a facilitator of a maiden's transition into marriage as well. Because in ancient Greece, they had quite gendered rites of passage. One of them being when a maiden, so a young girl, would transition into womanhood by marrying. She is distinctly a goddess of thresholds and the liminal, so not just life transitions, but physical spaces where ghosts were said to reside, such as the crossroads or before the gates of cities. And that's why we have things such as statues of Hekate or Hekatea in front of doorways, at the gates of cities, as noted in some cities, and at crossroads as well. And she was petitioned for protection specifically. So she wasn't necessarily offered to, or, there weren't rituals necessarily done for her because they were scared and wanted to keep her away. It was because Hekate could be petitioned for protection. Specifically here we see the Aioroi as a restless dead category significant to this context. So Aioroi again were the deceased who died prematurely, aka they were unable to fulfill a life transition. So in ancient Greek contexts, this also and significantly signifies girls who weren't able to marry or transition from maidenhood successfully, so they may have passed away beforehand, before it could have happened. Putting these elements together, her domain over life transitions and her association with the liminal spaces where the dead resided, and her protective elements, plus her 5th century associations, then you get Hekate, who is the leader of the restless dead, or the mistress of spirits or ghosts. So hopefully all of that gives you some idea on how she became the leader of the restless dead. And it wasn't just about her scary aspects or the darker things in association with her, darker in quotes. It was also covering her more benign and benevolent aspects of overseer of girls' transitions and protector. So now we have the story of Erigone, an Aoroi who died prematurely. And this myth has a few variations, though I've chosen one that has the most relevance here. And I do want to put a content warning that there are mentions of hanging, murder, and death in this story. Of course, this presentation is about the dead, but if more explicit mentions are activating or triggering for you, then feel free to skip ahead and come back to this afterwards. So in this version, Erigone is the daughter of Icarius, a king of Athens who learned how to make wine from Dionysus. He shared this wine with shepherds who became drunk, and because of this, their companions thought that the wine poisoned them, and then killed Icarius, burying him under a tree. His daughter Erigone searched for her missing father with her dog, and then found his grave. In grief, she hanged herself on the tree. In one version, Dionysus sends a plague over the land and sends all the maidens of Athens into a fit of madness, who then hang themselves. In another, it is Erigone who, as a prostropaios, a vengeful ghost, so here we have one of those alternative terms for describing ghosts or restless dead, a prostropaios, a vengeful ghost, who returns to curse Athenian maidens to hang themselves. And this is where the Athenians sought advice from the Oracle of Delphi and introduced the rite of Iora, swinging, during Anthesteria to fulfill the curse without bringing harm to maidens. So this is a situation where they had to consult an oracle because one person's problem became everyone's problem. And when it comes to the rite of Iora, it's described as, for example, swings in our day, where you just sit on a seat and swing. In this case, they had swings on trees to emulate that sort of swinging without harming any of the maidens. But we see here an example of where a restless dead spirit caused some chaos and cursed people because of her premature death, and for revenge, of course, as well, in her grief and sadness. So this brings me to the last segment of today's presentation, which is misconceptions regarding the restless dead. A question that I've come across, which is a valid question, but one I want to shine some light on, is did I invite the restless dead into my home? And this is because Hekate is the leader of the restless dead. They ask, if I invite Hekate, does that mean she brought the restless dead with them? Does that mean I invite them too? The answer is no for this one, because Hekate is a protector household goddess, and she was they say that she was in ancient times as well. So that's one of her other aspects too, that is more of the benevolent kind, where she would watch over thresholds, propylaia, she before the gate, and also she was Hekate apotropaia, she who averts evil. And so you don't have to worry about inviting the restless dead into your home just because you invite Hekate, because she's the one who will keep them away. And we also have the question, is any angry spirit just the restless dead? In which the answer is no as well. There are other angry quote-unquote spirits in Greek mythology. Some of them, for example, the Erinyes or the Furies, goddesses who are described as angry and furious as well. The Keres, who are spirits who reside over like battlefields, and they bring about violence and death in that way too, and they're described as angry or aggressive. And so once again, the restless dead isn't an umbrella term for every single spirit that may be described as restless, but a specific kind of deceased spirits of a person who wasn't able to move on to the afterlife, and so they become restless and wandering. These are my references and some further reading for you. So I read the Oxford Handbook of Monsters, specifically Oxford Handbook of Monsters and Classical Myth, specifically the chapter Ghosts, the Restless and Unpleasant Dead. We have Johnston's Restless Dead book here too, referenced Odyssey, and of course Erigone's story. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope that you got something out of this presentation. Let me know if you have any questions, and hopefully you can catch me at a future presentation as well.